the rate of psychopathic traits in founders is anywhere between 4 to 12x higher.
Why does no one talk about that?
If you apply for a loan at 3:30 in the morning, you're getting declined.
And if you aren't thinking about how the wind is taking you, you are going to be the victim of the wind.
To be clear, I'm not advocating for psychopaths in any part of society. However,
welcome to the first episode of Three Course Founders, where we have deeper conversations with entrepreneurs who are building the future. Every week, I'll be sitting down with a different startup founder from different industries, different stages of progress. But in all cases, these will be out in the world, typically over a meal or three, and with the purpose of breaking through to the stories they haven't yet told and the content you have not yet heard. And what are the three courses? The first one is about the unique market insight that they've learned along the way, not necessarily why they started their business, but what they might tell someone in their industry who is starting a startup today. The second course is mutual founder therapy, where we get to the hard parts of building a team, a startup, a game-changing business. And the third course is where we get into their strengths and weaknesses fueled by the people who know them best, their fellow founder friends. Who am I? My name's Sherveen. I'm the founder and CEO of venture-backed free agency. We provide Hollywood-style representation to tech talent. I'm also an angel investor, but more than anything, I am a startup nerd, and I love to have these conversations with my fellow builders. And here on episode 1, I'll be talking to my friend Matt Harris. He's the founder of Bloom Credit. They've built a platform and an API that enables other businesses to build innovative credit products. In other words, they can access consumer payment history, credit scores, and build unique experiences in fintech. Matt was the CEO of that business for 6 years, but nowadays, he's an executive coach at 27.9. It's a coaching practice of his own, where he's turning all of his experience building, advising, and investing in companies into support for other seed stage founders and early stage companies going through the tough stuff. It's a fun and challenging conversation. Hope you enjoy the show. So Matt, first course, we're doing coffee as our first course.
hello, friends.
And hello, friends. And the first course of these, of Three Course Founders, is all about the novel industry or role-specific insight that a founder has learned on their journey. And for all of our conversations where we've talked about the material of Bloom, which you started so many years ago, I've always learned something about credit and lending and just like the VC landscape and the startup landscape and what founders are getting right or wrong. And so let's spend this first course talking about that space. Let's begin with this simple question. What does everyone get wrong with credit and lending? And let's start here, right? From a very VC-backed startup-y landscape, what do people get wrong?
So oftentimes when people ask me this question, it's something I get asked a lot. I give like a really blunt answer.
Yeah.
And it's basically the idea that like VCs at its most basic fundamental core do not understand the idea that giving away money is easy, but getting it back is difficult.
Which, we are seeing the ruins of over the past few months. Absolutely. In so many ways.
And so there's a series of businesses that were gone and launched under this idea of that actually these businesses, when you think about the venture capital model is basically we're going to go build software. That software has a specific niche in market. And because it is software, it is ultimately going to scale.
Yep.
And that you'll find equity efficiency. Yep. Really, right? But when you think about lending, the way that VCs calibrated into lending was this idea that the key insight was going to be the ability to predict risk.
Underwrite better than anyone ever has.
Correct. By using all these different data points.
Alternative data.
Yes.
Almost always like some, founder or VC, probably at a hotel bar of like thinking, this must have correlation.
Correct. And it's like SAT scores, or it's like, where you went to school or stuff like that. And sometimes those do have correlations, but not necessarily for the reasons that VCs thought it would.
Okay.
And what you'd often end up finding is that these businesses would go and they would be like, cool, I have this really awesome idea.
Yeah.
And what VCs assumed is that the ability for a computer to shoot out an opinion was proprietary. Now, we could have, a computer analyze, there's like 5 different cameras right now for the audience, if you didn't know. Basically go and through each camera angle, develop some sort of opinion as to whether or not you and I would be more creditworthy, or
right.
who among us.
Right.
And it will give us an opinion. Doesn't mean it's a correct opinion.
And you said it's not proprietary. So it's both, is it competitive? And it seems like if what you've taught me about Bloom over time and credit scores is anything, it's like, actually that turns out to be a pretty useful one for understanding whether you get money back. And then the second thing being, if you did find another thing, how quickly will everyone else begin to
find it
as well?
Almost instant.
Right. And are there other things people have found?
So there are. And so, just to close out that one other thought there, for basically what VC is, they see someone super bright, probably worked at Google, being like, hey, like I found this really proprietary means of going analyzing data.
Right.
And if you're a non-technical venture capital investor,
Yep.
more data equals more linear insights is something that makes sense on paper.
Right.
That's ultimately not how data science works.
Right.
And so now you're like, okay, cool. And by the way, they're growing so quickly. And they told me that the returns are going to be good because, they had all this proprietary stuff. The second reason why this matters is because VCs didn't understand the concept of a lending vintage. Let's say I give you 100 loans. Let's say 20 of them don't repay. Now, hypothetically, if I go then issue 1,000 loans, my percentage of total defaults has gone down. So what would happen is...
Fantastic business model. Let me just get more money and my rates of failure decrease.
Correct. And so what has happened is basically, or what we saw in the last model was that a bunch of lenders basically gave out some loans. Whether they were performing or not, who knows? It was sometimes even too early in the cycle, would go get more money to go give out more loans. And every time they wanted to raise, they would raise on aggregate data, not vintage data.
So it's kind of like going cumulative versus cohort based.
Correct. And the way that it works is like, I wouldn't say that anyone who's doing this was doing it in a manner of maliciousness, but it is Ponzi scheme type tactics.
Did you see that Hindenburg report on Cash App?
I did.
Recently? It's not about lending necessarily, although some of it is Afterpay, but it's kind of they're saying the same thing about Cash App's users as like, oh, these underbanked users, regardless of whether or not they deserve certain products, and that's the whole thing, but like that serving them actually turns out not to necessarily be a great business model because they're going to use it for reasons that they are by others considered unbankable.
Correct.
Same thing's happening here.
Yeah. And so it's not always unbankable, but sometimes it's just the model is confusing the outcome where it's like, an example would be like Upstart, a really heavy machine learning oriented underwriting business lends to on average 700 FICOs.
Right.
And produces a negative 1.5 vintage. Another business called Opportune, who uses a predominantly more traditional model with two key core insights, which is actually really it's one insight, two. The first one is, do you walk into a branch? And the second one is, do you repay payday lenders on time? And those are like the two things.
You told me this branch thing. I don't know if it was in the context of this specific lender, but that seems to be like physical presence and conversation seems to be an underrated factor in lending businesses.
Well, I'll give another example, and I've talked about this with myself publicly before. So Bloom Credit raises its Series A publicly as far as the market is concerned in like September or October of 2020. Two things happened to me on that day. The first one is like Goldman Sachs and every wealth manager reached out being like, hey, like we'd like to work with you.
Yep.
The second one is Bank of America and JP Morgan rolled my credit limits back.
Interesting.
So why'd that happen? Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan understand the context of my life.
Right.
They're like, oh, well, this person, they may not know the specific financial data, but they're like, this person probably is on path to make a certain amount of cash. And they don't necessarily care whether or not I have debt because they know where my trajectory is going. They know the context, right? Now, JP Morgan and Bank of America don't know the context. They just look at me on a cohort basis. And so it automatically computer-generated triggered rule saw me pay down some debt. And they're like, oh, this person's had a credit limit of like, $100 and they've been running it at like $95 the whole time for the last like 4 years. Let's roll back to make sure that we don't end up with the risk of them going all the way up there again. Now,
interesting.
So this is an example of like computers actually can't do all the work to figure out context of someone's financial life. And sometimes you do need hand-to-hand combat. So where we really see the underwriting space going to in terms of how companies are going to start underwriting is not being like, oh, we're going to be able to like, find some crazy data point. It's more going to be like, hey, we're going to start using the context of what we see in our behavior with customers. And then we're going to use the data on our behavior of our application to then back into the other financial data rather than the other way around. So like a really great example of this would be like Rocket just acquired Truebill. It's really simple to see what they're trying to do there. It's like, oh, if you are like actively engaged on managing your subscriptions, you're positively selecting yourself for someone who cares about their money. And if you care about your money, then chances are you're probably going to repay a credit card. So what they do is they take the best Truebill customers and then they only lend to them rather than being like, we want to get anyone who's looking for a credit card. So you can see how this might go to different businesses. Like another.
So that alternative data is useful in that context. Differentiate that from where someone might make a mistake. So, if someone hears that, let's say even a founder hears that and is interested in this space, they go, fantastic. That means if I do find something like Truebill behavior data, some sort of alternative data like that, it should be reliable and allowing me to make better lending decisions. It sounds like it might be true here, but why is it generally not true?
So in this instance, it's what I would call contextual data, which is I know the context of the action that was taken because it exists in my universe. So an example would
I
be
even
like,
know what I do in the app to encourage this. I can backstop what is Truebill as an app doing engagement tricks versus the cohort that I do engagement tricks on, and normalizing for like, I sent a notification just because a lot of people paid. I know who paid above some sort of behavior trap.
correct. And so what we're looking for when we're underwriting is effectively what we, in data science, we'd say positive and negative selection, but it's positive selection for diligent behavior.
Right.
And so, if we think about what underwriting is really attempting to do, it's attempting to predict the likelihood of financial shock. Because anyone can lose their job. But are you going to be shocked by this?
Right.
Logic serves to say that the people who are going to be the least shocked by this are the people who are prepared for it.
Right. And most capable of having a financial normalization afterwards.
Correct. And so like a really good, there are companies in the world that do use alternative data, but it's because the regulatory environment allows them to use millions of data points potentially. So an example would be like Tala or Branch in, East Africa. Stuff that they look at is going to be stuff like, how do you format your contact list in your phone?
Really?
First name, last name, or just name, right? Another thing would be, how consistently are you walking between certain locations? So if you every single day go between work and home, that's consistent. If every single day your geolocation is wildly all over the place, probably not consistent behavior.
Right.
How consistently is your phone getting charged? Do you have consistent access to home, or is it constantly going between like 40, 15, 25, back to 10, up to 57, down to...
How often does it turn off because you're at actual zero?
Correct. So these are all consistent behaviors that allow a company like Tala to more effectively figure out, are you going to repay us back? How often are you speaking to your mom can be another one, right? But they take so much more data than we're allowed to. So then when you think about what that looks like in the US, it's like what each primary application should be.
Should we allow financial institutions to look at that data?
I'm mixed on this. Yes,
give me the pro, give me the con.
The pro is that there is something to say for there is something to be said for the degree to which it's a data in, data out problem, and that the nature of the data that has been created is pretty skewed against minority communities. So like an example that we were really focused on at Bloom is, when we raised our Series A, everyone was like, why aren't you enabling more alternative data? Our response was, I'd say, to put a number on this, and sorry if you're one of the VCs you passed on us for this, because we did talk to you about it. 70% of the no's we got at our Series A were, you're not enabling alternative data. My response was, this is absurd. I'm looking at these vintages. All these companies suck.
Right.
Like, at least from an underwriting perspective, they're awful. So I don't see why I would enable poor performance.
And they just wanted to see a different pathway. Like their default brain went, this is not differentiated enough, regardless of the fact you're telling me it would actually drive performance.
In that instance, we did exactly what we were supposed to do. We improved people's credit scores incredibly well. The integrations were really hard, and on top of that, the data is often incorrect. So what Bloom shifted to as a means of A, creating financial access, but B, also like fixing the problem we saw.
So essentially, what if I summarize your pro, right? The pro of that data would be something to the effect of it would enable more lending to folks who currently are locked out of it. And funnily enough, as it relates to Bloom stories, at some point you're going, we thought the consumer pathway was going to be our way to help people get access because we'll help them improve their credit score. But then you went, actually, everyone who's attempting to create a credit product is failing at serving these demographics, not because of credit score problems, not because of underwriting problems, but because they can't properly integrate with the bureaus.
They can't integrate with the bureaus, and then also the data in the bureaus is, in many instances, incorrect. So the bureaus may debate this in terms of the level of critical errors, but they're 33% of credit reports have errors on them.
And these errors are errors of a inputs problem, that they're receiving bad inputs, or are they collecting the inputs incorrectly or formatting them incorrectly?
Bad inputs. Basically, Metro 2, and sorry to my bureau friends who may be watching, but it's like Metro 2 is a multi-decade old integration standard to which people, let's say you make a payment to your Amex card, Amex reports that through Metro 2. Now, it's multiple decades old. It's written in a format of COBOL. So it's not even COBOL. It's like a special COBOL format, Metro 2 COBOL. So let's say that I was like, all right, free agency, you guys want to start reporting people's on-time payments. Right. And you wanted to go do that integration. Who here knows COBOL? Anyone?
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Is that why there are so many institutions that you would think, I've often asked, like, in different product areas, like, oh, why don't these folks report to credit institutions? Is a lot of the answer the technical integration would be impossible right now? Or not impossible, it'd just be like a cost that they don't want to bear, even if it would give them an ability to impact people, because you'd want that so you can threaten in a good way, presumably, hopefully, your customers to pay.
Yeah. And I think it's basically not threatened, but incentivized. It's the stick, not the carrot.
Yeah.
The other thing of this is it's like, A, you're not legally required to. Right. And B, if you do report and you mess it up, you are actually in the hook as the person who reports.
So then why does that not fix the problem that you're talking about? So they're reporting bad data in Metro 2 COBOL. So why are the incentives there? So, well, talk to me about that bad data. Why is that part happening?
So basically what's happening is you're taking, let's say it's an on-time payment. There's like 400 fields you have to go and actually furnish.
Okay.
So you're going to take your native language, let's say Python.
Yep.
And then you're going to translate it into this Metro 2 COBOL.
Yep.
As a means of making the report, and then you're going to translate it back into your system of record.
Right.
You can see how there's potential issues for bad data that goes into that. And then also what's difficult is that because the process is so difficult, it's really hard to build validations as to whether or not the actual data you said was supposed to be. So an example would be like if someone opened a card, say yesterday, and you're already reporting them 60 days late, impossible. And so the result is it's actually, if you think about that, that's a massive amount of financial issues.
Why does no one talk about that?
It's like the backside of like my going into other parts of my life of being an investor in fintech companies. Like everyone wants to talk about the super sexy ones like Robinhood, but the truth is the ones that are doing the most interesting stuff have nothing to do with that. It's all back end parts of our financial system, which are decades old.
So then give me the cons. So why wouldn't we want, access to this data other than the regulatory capture problem potentially being like a nuance of using it as it might be difficult to use it. But what are reasons that we would stray away from saying the US should be as pervasively integrated with people's lives?
I don't think we'd ever get through the political nightmare of it.
Like privacy.
It's like we couldn't even get people to properly report what was going on in their lives during a pandemic.
Right.
Let alone on an elective basis to get access to a loan. And the only people who would probably be willing to report it are already in financial distress.
But wouldn't a lot of I even think about, you have a lot of apps installed on your phone. You might even think about like an Apple or Samsung or Google with Android. Like, wouldn't these institutions be able to bake some of that stuff in such that it's, yes, you might have an opt-in, opt-out problem on the macro level, but it's kind of like opt into a regime of me helping you get better terms on a credit card or on a loan by enabling me to see alternative data? Wouldn't that be the easy way to do it versus like having it be...
There are versions of that where you can only use it as a positive selecting factor, not a negative selecting factor. But ultimately the result is that if you're the lender, it's like you start to run into... It's in
Well, you're just like serving more of your existing customer base in that case, right? Because you're not expanding the pie, probably.
And this is where there's a term called disparate impact that we talk about, which is that actually you disproportionately, if you wanted to give people really good rates on that stuff, you disproportionately give people bad rates who didn't fit those criterias that already existed. Because the thing is, it's like...
Those are the ones seeking solutions.
Like, the thing I would say is that actually the thing, like, let's go up multiple levels on this. It's like, should we or should we not do alternative data is actually different than the structural nature of the United States creates income disparity, which makes it really difficult to find any data arbitrage to try to disaggregate reality, which is there are a lot of people in this country who don't have enough money to take out a loan and are in financial distress. Right. So there's no amount of data arb that's actually going to allow you to get rid of that reality. If like the thing is that let's take Cash App as an example. Cash App's average FICO score is well below 600. If you have like a 580 credit score, you're already in delinquency. One thing I've wanted Cash App to launch is actually collections product. Like Cash App should be working with a company like TrueRecord to more effectively help the people who are on Cash App get out of collections and into financial stability. So there are means by which data can more effectively arbitrage this. That being said, the stuff that you're often going to find is that it's probably not going to be like, can we find SAT scores or something like that? It may look like doing what Tala does, which is open up the entire mobile phone, but Americans won't opt into that by and large.
Right.
So short of them being willing to say like, you can look at every single data point I have, everything from like what type of mobile phone games I play to how often I'm talking to my parents to like anything that looks like that.
Some good positive engagement loops that we could come up with.
Well, in like other countries, like another example of this is like, and this is kind of messed up, but there are lenders in China who will, and this is kind of I'm almost like, should I say this on a podcast or not? But it's like there are lenders in China who will give you secured loans against naked pictures.
Oh, wow.
It's like, how do you create the incentive structure to your point on the loop? It's all basically like, how do I when you look at it from an American point of view, how do I properly and effectively understand the behavior set that will naturally put you in the type of behavior to actually go and complete the behavior I'm looking for? So in lending, what we often look for would be like, let's say your search term that you go and actually try to get the loan on. I need money, negative selection. I'm looking for a Chase Platinum Reserve card.
Right.
Positive selection, because you're looking for something specific and you're actually researching it, right?
I'm buying a home.
Correct. And so you find different versions of that wind up coming into play. And so ultimately what we're trying to do is create positive and negative selection within that. And then understanding the context is even better. So like, another example of a positive and negative selecting point is like, what time of day did you apply for the loan? If you apply for a loan at 3:30 in the morning, unless if you're like an 850 credit score, you're getting declined.
People should know that. That's a great insight.
Because why would you be doing that?
Right.
Who looks for money at 3:30 in the morning?
Right.
And what you often find is the people who are applying for loans at 3:30 in the morning have really poor FICOs.
Right. It's so interesting how, one of the guiding principles I have in life, and my team hears me say it all the time, I have this phrase, it goes with the wind. And what I'm trying to say is how trivial, you don't realize how trivial so many things are. And so my example in the context of our business all the time is like an interviewer might be in a bad mood, and so you lost a job that you might have been perfect for. And that's just the way it goes. And you're trying to fight the wind.
Right.
And this is another way that people should think about it is like, you don't know how many things are working against or for you at any given time, some of which you don't even realize. And if you aren't thinking about how the wind is taking you,
correct,
you are going to be the victim of the wind.
Totally. If you're trying to like ultimately get access to a loan, you'd really want to think about like, what is the behavior set that I can actually emulate that would be financially diligent behavior?
Right. Fascinating. Okay. With this portion of the tasting menu complete, course 1 complete.
There you go.
Very nice. All right, time for course 2, Matt, where we're going to get into mutual founder therapy, as I'm calling it. We'll see how that goes.
Love it.
Unqualified, uncertified therapy, as we like to do. So, one of the things we were chatting about when we were texting about this conversation was the idea of your brain on VC funding, and I find that like a fascinating place to start. Let me ask you this question: if you were going to turn to VCs and say, here's what you don't understand about founders and that you should about their brain on VC funding, what insight would you try to deliver directly into their brains?
The idea that ultimately the founder and the company are an organism that need to actually practice a lot of self-care in order to take care of themselves well enough to take care of the business.
And when they're on VC funding, they don't?
It's that they don't in a lot of ways, and that they're, and you and I have had discussions about this that I know we are on opposite ends of that, like most of the science of how the body works does not seem to seep its way into the reality of like what goes on within running a company. The other side of this would be there's a lot of positions that founders often put themselves in, which are actually massively vicarious to the nature of the business. An example would be like a founder underpaying themselves.
Right.
Which actually VCs might think, and even the founder may think, are like, oh, I am saving runway for the business. And so therefore I am like ultimately helping, but actually what starts...
Or putting more of the outcome on an equity result.
Sure, potentially. But the thing is that let's say I live in New York City and I currently pay myself $45K a year.
Right.
We can agree that's going to be difficult to live on in New York City, especially trying to live a founder lifestyle with other founders who may be paying themselves more.
Totally.
Right. You're going to take on debt. So that's one stress point.
Yep.
Going to be hard to remember to get rent. You might be worried about putting food on the table. There might be a bunch of things that are going on. The thing is that all of these things play part in the nervous system.
So it's funny as I agree with you on this one, but I will say I've seen studies that say that founders who stay under a certain threshold do correlate to better equity outcomes, even for themselves. Even though I probably agree with you. I don't remember the exact number, but it was a number that when founders went above that threshold, maybe it was 150, something like that, you suddenly saw a negative correlation to an equity outcome.
So there's a part of this I agree with.
Yeah.
The point isn't to say
pay yourself a lot.
Pay yourself exorbitant amounts.
Yeah.
The point is to say, pay yourself enough that you are not thinking about money.
So let's get to where you and I disagree, because this is interesting. So where you and I disagree comes to, I think, a fundamental, and we've talked about this mostly on Twitter. I think first of all, I think most of those studies are done on normal people, even normal CEOs, not venture-backed CEOs. So I have a hypothesis that if all of those studies were run on people running our sorts of businesses, they'd turn out to be wrong.
Okay.
And then the second is that there are all of these moments inside these businesses that wind up being like watershed or like landmark moments where if you orient towards what the studies tell you, you'll die.
I would agree with the second one, actually.
Okay.
So the first one is when you so one thing I believe for the audience is that ultimately most studies, and there have been probably 50 done, state that human beings that work more than 50 hours a week are actually counterproductive. And the
counterproductive or less productive? Diminishing returns?
Less productive, it's diminishing returns, but then also every hour after that 50 actually probably means that the previous hours before it were more unfocused than they should have been. So maybe it's diminishing returns. You could make an argument that if you spent properly, it was counterproductive because 50 focused hours is better than 80 chaotic hours. But
humans are imperfect. So like the challenge being if you try to solve the 50 thing, but you don't solve, like if you try to solve not doing more than 50, but you don't fix your early 50, you're probably not losing.
But the thing that a lot of people miss in this, in my opinion, is that the brain is a muscle like anything else.
Yeah.
So there's a book written by, I'm forgetting their names, but the book is called The Powerful Engagement. And it's written by these two sports psychologists who started working with knowledge workers. And you can basically summarize the book into this. In sports, it is actually widely accepted that muscles need rest.
Right.
The brain is a muscle,
right?
Just like my hamstrings, just like anything else. So the muscle needs rest. And so the thing that starts to happen when we start overworking our brains is that our nervous system starts to say like, oh, something's wrong because I'm needing to work harder.
Right.
And so it starts to send signals being like, I'm tired. Being like, oh, like
there's clearly some survival threat.
Yeah, we need to. It's like, think about this. Like, have you ever met someone who's on very little sleep and they become irritable and a little aggressive?
Never. Okay, hold on. Here's a question.
Yeah.
If you could control that, is that the only downside of it, right? Is it the nervous system response that you're primarily concerned about when you talk about this muscle being overworked?
I really need to, I'm going to have to find this for you because it's going to be such an outlandish statement, but I swear I read a psychologist paper, a research paper recently that actually dictated that there's an aspect of not being a sociopath, but being a psychopath, which is being an evolved being to our current day in society. So think about it like this,
which is some sort of intellectual. Yeah.
And so the idea is, why do we have self-consciousness?
Yeah.
It's because 100,000 years ago, if we're living in a tribe, the way that you enforced laws, because there were none, was social behavior. So if I wound up being like, poking you constantly and that was annoying, you'd kick me out of the tribe.
Right.
And then I would be dead within the week.
Right.
So that was our enforcement structure. Now, our society has evolved, but our nervous system hasn't. So we still carry that for the most part. Which is to say that the nervous system ultimately is still playing out two possible danger scenarios that happen, and it's working with our entire body to do so. So it's like your nervous system doesn't know the difference between a literal tiger in the room and your bank account running out of money each month. So when you're actively having these conversations, it's not so much like, oh, I'm just having this fundraising meeting. It's like, oh my God, I hope this goes well. What if this doesn't? What if the company dies? All this stuff. So it starts to take some wear and tear on you. The third thing that I think is really interesting is that the person who is fundraising is speaking constantly throughout the day. So they're getting less oxygen. So what happens when your body gets less oxygen? It's used to a certain amount of oxygen. It's not getting it. It starts to send a signal to say, oh, like we need more oxygen. We need more here. We need to do something else. So what you often
breathing
see,
changes,
right, is that like you'll start to see, and I'm doing it right now because I've been speaking, so I'm even going to slow down. It's like breathing goes down, speed goes up, manner in which the voice is being spoken from goes up, and so it's signaling danger. Ultimately, like what I recommend to founders while they're fundraising is like there's a lot of things you can do. There's really two things you should be doing. The first one is take probably 2, maybe 3 breaks throughout the day to do what I would call quiet breathing exercises, not deep breathing exercises. What you want to do is make sure that you can't hear your breathing. You're getting full in through the belly and then breathing out slowly. If you can, elongate the outhale than the inhale. The second thing I say, which not everyone loves, is cold showers at the end of every day.
Right.
Because that also activates the vagus nerve. Why? I'm less versed on that. I know it works. I don't really care whether or not the science is backed on it because I felt it. Or sorry, I know the science backs it, but like the specific thing.
So here are two questions. The first one is more like I'm going to storytell a little bit and then ask the question. Something that is said about me by others, investors, people who know me as founder. People are surprised I'm not burned out. I'm probably like one VC once said I was probably the hardest working founder they'd ever seen.
I believe it.
And people then ask me like, why don't, and I have hard times. I've had hard times because of what's going on in the company. I've had hard times because of fundraising. But one of the interesting parts of it is I never feel burnt out or like really, really nervous system anxious because of those things. I will for other causes. And I think one of the reasons is I might have this like, because I'm an immigrant to the US, because I had hardships growing up, whatever. I don't have the sense of threat from like, if I didn't fundraise and I had to go get a product job, whatever. If I get hit by a bus tomorrow, my mother instilled in me such a good way of looking at the value of life. And, you know, always, she's a physician and she'd always make statements growing up of like, look at how good your life is, even if we're going through whatever we're going through. Where maybe my body is a little more accustomed to not thinking of a tiger. So given that like, I have that experience, first of all, does that seem legitimate to you based on, you know, what I'm saying? Is this something that I'm just like, you know, self-contextualizing and intellectualizing for myself? And then is this a muscle that founders should be building, or a different way, you know, we should be thinking about mindsets, because ultimately it would give them an ability to go through these moments that they might have to go through?
Yeah. The truth is everyone has a different tiger. How that tiger manifests is very unique to you. But ultimately, the reason why every company tends to have a tiger is because the founder is the one who set it up. So,
but it does, and is there a difference in the connection of that tiger to the nervous system? As in, are some founders able to have, no matter what form the tiger is taking, evolving, do they have less of a response to the tiger? Have they built a resilience to the idea of the fight or flight reaction?
Yes, I would say so. This is often why second-time founders are better than first-time founders.
Right.
Is because the second-time founder went through this journey of seeing these things and then isn't as affected by it.
Because they know the threat isn't as harsh as it seems.
Correct. Because the thing that's really important, the really important detail we haven't hit on as it relates to this, is that the nervous system hasn't evolved what society has. You know, I published a study recently, and I got a lot of like self-selection versus positive, negative, whatever. But basically, the rate of psychopathic traits in founders is anywhere between 4 to 12x higher than the general population, depending on how you define it. And so part of that is like self-selecting, which is like VCs tend to float towards that personality because there's a certain level of ruthlessness, because you're managing a business, not like a family or friends, right? Yep. But that's easier said than done.
Yep.
Like oftentimes, you've probably seen this, I've seen it, you'll talk to a friend and they'll be like, I should fire this person. Or sorry, they're not saying they should fire the person.
But you have it in your head.
Yeah, they're describing like a problem with a potential employee.
You fired the person already in your brain.
Right. And you're like, oh, well, like, you know, oh, well, I'm not in fear around this. So great. Like you should just fire them. They're like, whoa. And they try like 6 other things and they come back to you 6 months later and they're like, yeah, you're right. I should have done that.
Yeah.
Right. So, but someone who's like more on the psychopathic spectrum doesn't have that. So it's actually easier for them to do the right thing for the business, even if it's not necessarily the thing we'd like as society. So the answer is like, to be clear, I'm not advocating for psychopaths in any part of society. However, the reason why the psychologist did, and I will make sure I get the study so you can put it in the show notes, because otherwise it's a super difficult thing to say, is that like there are parts of this that you can see the positive selection happening on a societal level, where like, and again, the difference between that and sociopathy would be like sociopathy would be violent in some capacity versus just like, I don't take as much pressure on myself during these circumstances. But that being said, pressure can show up anywhere. I can say from my founder experience, I was definitely in the category of like very, very, very concerned about how others people thought of me in terms of like the board, my employees, things like that. And I spent and actually combined with a unwillingness to let things go. So it was a lot of me trying to push forward results, not delegating properly, and trying to keep everyone happy at the same time.
Right.
And so the thing I always say for founders in my position is like, one of two things is true. Either the company will break or you will. I'm not sure which, but we'll certainly find out. Right. In my case, it happened to be me, but like, you know, there's tons of examples of that. And so when you ask the question of like different types of tigers and like metabolizing it, the answer is it's like second-time founders do it really well. I find parents do it really well.
Yeah.
Because parents have other things that are drawing them away from the business. So
they have bigger tigers in life.
Correct. So it just doesn't feel that intense.
Right. They're almost willing to lose to a startup tiger because they have the kid tiger.
Correct. or whatever may be showing up in that
in
regard.
the family. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's another reason why it's like, one cohort of founder that is like really prevalent is like former Israeli military.
Right.
Like, it's not as hard to be thrown off. It's a lot harder to be thrown off by startup problems when you've literally been shot at.
Right.
And so the nervous system can adapt and change, but by and large, we have these like instinctual things that are happening. And really the intention is not to be like one size fits all. This works this way. This works this way. You probably have more capacity to work more hours than I do. I'm super ADHD and sensitive. So when I try to work that much, my focus just is gone. Right. So I have to be really attentive about how much time I do, because while I have a lot of energy, it goes a lot of places.
Right.
It's like, it's probably why I'll never be a founder again. Or if I am, it's probably like a decade from now as like me being the CEO of a company, because ultimately, like, in order to keep me from overanalyzing concepts too much and actually putting whip into the system, I need multiple things at any given point.
That's interesting. So because, I think about my own founder psychology, and I'm going to remember my second question after I say this one. The places in which I've made the biggest mistakes, I actually don't think come from, and this is why I was asking the question, have not come from moments where my nervous system is most reacting. My nervous system might react as to the consequence of those mistakes, but it's interesting to think about that, because what winds up, I guess, being interesting is, do founders make mistakes in heights of stress, or do they make mistakes generally? Would be an interesting way to look back on like how someone did in decision making as a founder and what sort of businesses they're fit for. For example, a go-to-market business where you're constantly under threat, you have competitors, you are in, Uber's context, or, whatever Travis would do or whatever it might be, needs someone who doesn't add whip, as you said, like doesn't like it's more about like being able to survive the tigers, or like not have your nervous system break you down. It's business decisions. It's like in front of a counterparty, versus a different sort of founder who maybe is not as good in moments of stress, but is good over a long term, let's say hard tech. And it's like, I've got to build a product over the next 4 years and I have to go away. And I don't care about threats that are proximal, because they're not. They're usually distant.
So there's a term I like to use for when I teach founders. So like one thing that I often say when people are doing storytelling is that storytelling, in terms of how you fundraise, a lot of people will think about it like, oh, I need to list all these facts about the business and I need to prove it's a good business, rather than the idea of recognizing that like human beings resonate with narrative. So actually it's more important someone understand your story than that you throw all these facts and figures into it. To be clear, there are times when you should overwork. But what I always ask the founder to do is be like, walk me through why the 16 hours you're going to put in today is going to make a material change for the business. Right. 9.5 out of 10 times they can't. So it's like, oh, this is just wasted time then.
That's interesting. So, and this brings me to my second question overall, because this is a microcosm of the second question, which is what I was going to ask about this whole idea of founders and nervous systems and the stress we put everyone under. My posit about the market being this thing that has not produced great companies. We have been lucky to see how many startups and founders have achieved this. What if creating great companies requires founders to go through, and early stage teams to go through these moments? What if it's required? What if the idea of the overworked hours? What if the idea of the living paranoid? What if the idea of all of this stuff that might have negative nervous system consequences is what is required to build a truly great company? Again, I'm not saying like, I don't want to offend a random founder of some company, but like not a zero interest rate phenomenon company. And the reason I ask this question is like, I do believe that this is probably true. I believe to build institutionally great companies that are industry defined and that are game changing, it must be true just by the nature of how much you are attempting to do and change, that these are moments that are fundamentally non-optional. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that people can't help you go through them. So let me say that. But I guess I still ask that question.
What I would say is it's going to happen naturally, but it doesn't have to be hard. It probably will be. Like to all the founders out there, no sugarcoating it. This is a really hard thing. I usually ask founders two things before they found a company. And to get to your answer, the first one is, do you recognize first and foremost this is a growth journey for you, not a money-making opportunity? And it might be good for your career, but hard to say. So the first thing that happens is you have to acknowledge you're going to grow from this. The second thing is what I say, do you have a warrior mindset? Do you care so much about this problem that you can't imagine doing anything else? Because it's what carries you through this other stuff. So what I would say is the stuff we're talking about, where you're like, well, you have to go through this. I would say yes. I agree. But it's not because the external reality has to look that way. It's because the external reality is ultimately going to change the nature of the internal reality.
What if me talking fast and every founder talking faster than they did at year 2 inside their business is actually a prerequisite for startup success?
So I would say there is an aspect of that. The founder is a self-starter is a really big part of that. And a big part of the reason why a lot of founders do speak really quickly is because they can take in a lot of information. They are seeing a lot of things.
And like they feel the need to put it out as quickly as possible as well.
Yeah. And something you've said on Twitter, which I do agree with, is like founders are genuinely exceptional.
Right.
I don't believe we break the laws of like human physiology. Like that being said, like we are special enough that we are clearly doing stuff that is different than Gen Pop.
Right. Right. Exactly. All right. Course 2. On to the next one. Okay, so I chatted with some of your founder friends.
Oh, no.
I asked them some questions, and I want to ask you some questions based on their questions.
Great.
And the first interesting thing that they said, I'm wondering if you agree and what you think about it generally.
Yeah.
One of them said that if you were to join or if you were to start another startup, the industry that they think you would excel in is healthcare, because it is not just ripe for disruption, but from a regulatory standpoint, you might be good at dealing with that based on, the prior experience. Are you going to be a healthcare founder?
Actually, there's something to that. So the reason I'm not a founder right now for the audience is because going back to the nervous system stuff, I think it is an incredibly difficult job to do. And candidly, the problems I'm currently drawn to just don't require venture funding, which is really I think the founding experience is really difficult. And there are a lot of ways that you can help founders and investors more effectively metabolize what I would call making massive change on the planet. And so that being said, there has been one idea that I've thought about, which I see as 10 years down the road, which is what if we had Whoop for nervous systems?
Does that look like a feature on Whoop or what? Yeah, tell me more.
I don't know if it's you integrate it into Whoop or if it's own wearable, because candidly, the data set doesn't exist yet of trying to take what we already have, which is my heartbeat is going up. And then also saying well, can I also measure what your breathing looks like? Can I do all these other things? And can I measure the outcome and the state of that? So it's actually a measurement problem in that regard, where we don't yet have the data to measure what those things are. And if we do, it's not easily accessible to build on top of. But that's actually a very good prescient point, and I'm so curious you said that.
You'll find out afterwards.
But yeah, also to whoever said that, I think you got to remember, after getting integrations into credit bureaus for years, I'm not super jacked up about bureaucracy anymore.
But you'd be amazing at getting EMR integrations or maybe Apple Health data.
For the record, I mean, if we think about Bloom, I raised $20 million. Bloom has over 70 customers. By most points, I'm a pretty good founder. I just don't like it. So what I'm good at and what I'm actually willing to do are different things.
Right.
But also if anyone wants to hack to get through bureaucracy, I can tell you what it is, and it's you out bureaucrat the bureaucrats.
So, okay, the next interesting thing one of them said is that you're very good at playing 5D chess. What do you think they meant?
I'd say one of my superpowers is the ability to take multiple disparate data points of this thing over here and this thing over here and combine them to make a clear, coherent narrative. Mm-hmm. And part of this having an open mind, and part of this just seeing the interconnectionality between multiple things. So an example would be if we're talking 5D chess, one of the things that I typically end up seeing. So I'll give an example of something that wound up happening recently in my coaching practice. I found out recently that one of my founders was severely underpaying themselves. And that actually the board of this company were really okay with this. Now let's take the basic math of this. The basic math is less salary going to the founder or anyone at all equals longer runway equals greater chance of success. I don't see it that way. The way I look at it is less salary for the founder equals more stressed founder. More stressed founder equals more chaotic roadmap. More chaotic, basically instruction into what's going on in the business. The less focused and chaotic the founder is, the more things the company tries to do, is all of them mediocre. You actually have lost your ability to calibrate the ability to pull levers to get things done naturally. Where most people just see, the founder's unfocused, I see the founder's actually overwhelmed.
Right. Right.
And so that's like my means of attempting to play that out. But like that might be an example of the 5G chess they're talking about, where like the normal cause and effect of like, oh, founder can't focus. I just didn't see the same cause and effect. I saw it as like, oh, we're not taking care of this person.
How do you give someone else, another founder, the ability to play 5D chess? And
I don't think I can.
Really?
No.
So yeah, that's maybe a prerequisite for being, well, a certain type of founder that you have to have already.
I would say that's something very specific to me, but what I would say is like the best way to do it is really have an open mind. Like what we were talking about before of like, you have to be able to engage with every concept, even as absurd as it seems, as possible.
I often call it like founder brain, and it could be a proxy of paranoia, but it's kind of like going, I can connect these dots rapidly enough, and I'm constantly doing it in an attempt to make sure that on a fundamentals basis, I'm not missing any potential web, because all of this can be like a very big tech tree, a very big web of ability, if only you knew the pathways and the buttons that you could push to unlock the next tree over.
Yeah. Like I always say, companies go through 3 stages: learning, growing, and fixing. And so it's like sometimes you are applying growth mentality in a moment where you should be paying off debt. Stuff like that. So like, it's just asking why are we doing what we're doing and stuff of that nature. And so being able to see things as interconnected makes that relatively easy, versus like if you have a closed mind, no, I need to be growing because that's what everyone says I have to do. It makes it really hard to see what's possible.
Right. This one's a fun one that I'll ask for your one-liner answer on. Why does someone think that you should build the direct-to-consumer, on-demand Margaritaville cocktail delivery company?
I have no idea. That's definitely
It wasn't. It wasn't. It was so hot.
Oh, well, that would be my second guess. Why he thinks I should build a what type of company?
It was a direct-to-consumer, on-demand Margaritaville cocktail delivery company. That's very also specific.
Oh man, I don't even know if I know what that is. So I probably shouldn't do that.
We'll see.
But I appreciate that coming from Ohad.
So here's the last one. Someone of this group said that you are a magnet for enthusiastic talent. That's such an interesting word. It wasn't just a magnet for talent or smart talent, enthusiastic talent. Do you think that's true? And what does that mean?
I think there's something to that, of people who have like met team members of mine before. And I think probably if I had to like guess as to why that is, it's because like I try to, when I'm in my most relaxed states, I just tend to be very playful. And I tend to think it's like, most things we think matter don't. And like, honestly, it's like, again, I'm being a little cliche here, but it's just like, life isn't to be taken that seriously. And also to combine that with like one of, I'd say, A, my superpowers, but B, like something that tends to like have a regressive form to it, is I see the best in everyone. So like when I'm working with someone, I'm like, this is the amazing part of who you are. And I try to really bring that out. I used to really try to do that in the actual recruiting process to like sell them back to themselves. Now, the downside of that,
their sharp edge, basically.
Yeah, the downside of that being is that sometimes I tend to overlook the shadow of what we say. And so sometimes that can have, cause and effect. But like, I tend to really, really, really believe that it's like, most human beings have a lot of incredible, amazing talent. And I just like to see that for what it is. Yeah, now that I think about it, a lot of my team is really enthusiastic, or they were really enthusiastic in a lot of ways.
Essential for the startup experience.
Yeah, and like, a lot of the people I work with are the same way. So,
right.
That is super cool to see.
Well, that was the third course. Matt, good.
You out-bureaucrat the bureaucrats. You like take notes on what they say, and then you're like, I'm gonna give this to your boss later. Does this sound good? And they're like, no.